We need revival because more times than not, we go through the motions of ministry without the power of God upon our lives. Now, I'm going to explain what I mean by that. I want to read it one more time. We need revival because more times than not, we go through the motions of ministry without the power of God upon our lives. In other words, the ministry we do weekly as a church is done in nothing more than sheer human effort. Church and ministry at times have become routine and mechanical, and rarely do we see God work in His power, and rarely do we experience the blessing that only He could give to our church. At times, even though we would never admit it, I think we actually believe, we've actually come to the place in our life and in our ministry where we are convinced that we can operate our church without God's help. Now that's a scary place to be. In other words, we have gone through the motions and the routine and the mechanics of ministry for so long that we think that we know exactly how to do it and we can get the job done actually without God's help. Now, I don't know about you, but at the end of this message, I hope you realize that we need desperately God's help. We, in our strength and our ability and our wisdom, we can only go so far. You see, when we experience revival, we come to the realization that we are totally inadequate. And without God, ultimately, we can do nothing. We can come to church, we can go through the motions, we can have a service like this, we can sing the songs, we can teach the classes, I can get up and preach, and we can all go home and go, wow, we got an incredible church. But did God meet with us? You see, there's a big difference between just going through the motions of church and truly meeting with God and experiencing God's power in our lives and in our ministry and experiencing His blessing upon our ministry. If you have a Bible, I invite you to open it to the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 9, I want us to look at 2 verses specifically, and I'll be referring to several different verses in this portion of Scripture. Mark chapter 9 and verse 28 and 29. Because this really is a wonderful illustration of what I'm talking about here this morning. Mark chapter 9 verse 28 says, "And when He," that is Jesus, "was come into the house, His disciples asked Him privately, 'Why could not we cast him out?'" I'll explain more about that in a moment. "And He said unto them, 'This kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting.'" Now I want to go back and I want to read both verses again. All right, and then we're going to talk about this morning. Verse 28. "And when He was come into the house, His disciples asked Him privately, 'Why could not we cast him out?' And He said unto them, 'This kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting.'" Now, before I deal with these 2 verses, I want to briefly talk with you about what takes place in this chapter. There are essentially 2 main events recorded for us in Mark chapter 9. Now, Mark chapter 9 is literally a chapter with 50 verses, and there's a lot of wonderful things that are jam-packed into this chapter. But 2 main events, I'm going to give them to you. Number 1, the first event in Mark chapter 9 is what we call the Mount of Transfiguration. All right? And you can see that beginning in verse 2 down all the way to verse 13. Bible historians tell us that most likely this event took place on Mount Hermon because it is the highest point in the area. For a brief moment, you remember the story. If you've been to Sunday school or you've been to church throughout the years, you've heard the story about the Mount of Transfiguration. Because for a brief moment, Peter, James, and John had the unique privilege of seeing the majestic glory of Jesus Christ and all of His deity burst through the veil of his humanity. Just for a brief moment, they experienced that up on the Mount of Transfiguration. It was one of those moments that was so memorable that they never, ever forgot it. Many years later, Peter wrote about this incredible event, and he says this in 2 Peter 1, verse 16 and 17, that they were eyewitnesses of his majesty, and that they had heard this voice which came down from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And then he says in verse 18, "We were with him in the holy mount." So imagine Peter, James, and John. They go up this mountain, most likely Mount Hermon. And they don't know why they're going. They probably think they're going up there to spend time talking with Jesus, being taught, shaped, and formed, and developed into the leaders that Christ wanted them to be. Maybe they thought they were going to spend time in prayer. But there up on that mountain, suddenly Jesus is transfigured before them. And his true identity bursts through his humanity. And they see him in all of his majesty and all of his glory just for a few minutes. And Peter never got over that. He said, "We were eyewitnesses. We were there with him on the mount. And we heard the voice come down from heaven that said, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.'" But not only did Peter, James, and John see the true identity of Jesus that day, but they also saw Elijah and Moses talking to Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. And they were talking about what he was about to go and accomplish on Mount Calvary, where he would literally suffer, bleed, and die for the sins of all humanity. And that means that he died for your sin and my sin. And there's Moses and Elijah, and they're with Jesus, and Peter, James, and John, and they're watching all of this take place. Can you imagine being on the mount there, the Mount of Transfiguration, and experiencing what Peter, James, and John did that day? Wow, something you'd never get over.